co-founded GSM Capital, the first global wireless venture fund with offices in Boston, London, and Hong Kong. In 2004, Alan co-founded Actra Wireless, and in 2008, Real Ventures, which is Canada's most active venture fund with more than 90 investments in internet startups.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to say it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. As you heard, just being here, I'm now 52 as of last Saturday. It seems really young. I'm sure it seems really old to you guys. What I tried to do today was to share with you a little bit of how this globalization phenomena that we've been talking about sort of affected my life, and try and make it more tangible for the two seminars that Paul and myself had the pleasure of giving to you. I also just met Nika for the first time, and she is sort of the epitome of something that I've had the joy to witness. And what I tried to do first was, using Thomas Friedman's flat earth framework, talk about how globalization has evolved from the 1400s to the 1800s, the first wave around countries, colonialization, searching resources, moving to more of a company-led around the Industrial Revolution from 1800 all the way through to this century. And then the real wave that's dramatically affected my life, and you've been born into, everything that has provided the foundations for the internet and access basically for the majority of the world, thanks to mobile devices, to all the world's information, to all the ideas that are being traded, to a new level of openness and collaboration. And for somebody such as Nika to suddenly turn her amazing research into something that can be quickly tested and applied into as far away as South Africa, it's just mind-boggling. And so that was what I was wanting to share with you, what I describe as, what Thomas Friedman rather describes as the new individual empowered phase of globalization has created an explosion of entrepreneurs. It's much easier to start something new. It's going to dramatically be more inclusive in who's participating. It won't just be the Silicon Valleys of the world. And so it's very exciting. I'm happy to field questions on that front.
And now we'll hear from Mr. Paul Tellier.
Well, let me first say that, as I was mentioning, to Patrick Piotto at lunchtime, I have found this experience of interfacing with you very rewarding and very enjoyable. I think that for those of us who are somewhat older than you are, it's the best way for us to stay young. What I'm going to do in my concluding remarks in the next minute, if I was in your shoes and I was starting all over again, based on what I have seen over the last many years, both in the public sector and in business, I would say, one, I would learn as many languages as possible. I know two. I'm working hard to try to learn a third one, Italian. You're going to say, why Italian? It's because I like the language. But believe me, the older you get, the more difficult it is to learn a language. So I would learn languages. And we North Americans are not very good at this. You do business with Dutch people, you do business with Belgian people, with Swedes, unless they have 4 or 5, they consider themselves ignorant. Point number one. Point number two, visit the world. I sat on the Rhodes Scholarship selection committee at McGill some few years ago. 15 finalists. What they had in common, I think 14 of them, they knew Asia. One a woman said, one of the female students said, I know Asia quite well. I said, what do you mean? Spent 3 weeks there? She said, no. I spent 8 months cycling across Vietnam. So see the world. 3, there is a big difference between information and analysis. We all suffer from information pollution. We have an awful lot of information at our end. But we've got to connect the dots. We've got to analyze the information that comes. We have to think about what is going on. I gave you this morning, the example of Ukraine and Crimea and so on and so forth. Second but last, you may be surprised by this. Stay in shape. Whatever you do in this world now, physical fitness is critical. When I fly to Perth, for instance, as I do several times a year in Australia, flying time in a plane is 27 hours. When I get there, if I don't exercise, if I'm not in shape, I cannot make a contribution to the meetings that I go to. Lastly, I have on my desk a Christmas card that I received from a Swiss businessman a few years ago. And it's a quote for Michelangelo. And Michelangelo said, "Don't worry about having a very high level dream and failing. It is much better than regretting not having such a dream." Good luck to all of you. I really enjoyed that.
Finally, Aim Singping is a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia and a visiting professor at McGill University. Prior to her academic career, Aim consulted for the World Bank and worked for the government of Thailand. Her professional experience spans various sectors, including investment banking and non-government organizations. Currently, Aim consults for world-leading analysis and forecast firm, IHS. She also serves as a social media analyst for Global Voices Online and is an active blogger on Southeast Asian affairs at New Mandala.
It's going to be hard to top that. So I'm just going to talk about, how I felt when I was in your seats. I remember back when I was your age, what I wanted to do was change the world. That was all I wanted to do. I was fortunate enough to be in a school full of students from all over the world. It was an international ambassador school. And I learned about so many different things just talking to people in the hallway. So as I grew up, my main passion was to study protest. Why do I study protests and why do they interest me? It's because I want to know what makes people get up and go out onto the streets and demand for something. I grew up in a country where you could go to jail or be dead doing and thinking just that. And that feeling that the feeling of helplessness and the feeling of oppression never leaves me, even though I've moved to Canada, where there's so much freedom in the world to do just that, but so little protest going on. So part of my passions and my academic life studies, how do people get onto the streets? How do they get connected online? What kinds of different social media tools get people organized together? What kind of causes or changes they want to bring? And so what I've talked about today was to trying to bring you to both the positive and the negative sides of the internet. That's what I teach at UBC. That in fact, just the very fact that these technologies make it so easy and instant for you to get involved doesn't mean that you can't stop starting to ask questions about why you want to get involved and what change can you really bring through those technologies. Also start asking more questions about what corporations do and what governments do in terms of either facilitating or hindering your ability to get engaged. And so what I hope that I leave with you today is never lose sight of that feeling that you can change the world. And these panelists are a great example of that. As you grow up, hold on to that. You can still do it, and it's even easier than before today, than ever before, to make a change. Just make sure that you understand what change you want to bring, what contribution you can make, and be informed and be aware of your surroundings, and learn from other cultures. Reach across the globe through your phones. Ask people in other countries how they feel about certain issues and certain things, and really learn about it. So that when you do decide to make a change or get engaged, that you're informed, you're smart about getting engaged, and understand the risks of getting involved in certain issues and fighting, and particularly fighting for people who live in places where they don't have that freedom to do it.
Okay, so now we're going to open the floor to some questions that I actually have a question of my own that I'd like to ask. Uh, there's this doctor in the United States, his name is Dr. Eric Topol, and basically what he does is he's integrated like a lot of technology in his medical practice. He uses the iPhone and attachments for the iPhone as scanners that can, so you can like skip the x-ray process and do it yourself. And he's basically saving a lot of money for a lot of people and making the entire medical process a lot easier. Do you think this is the future of like of medicine in a more globalized world for Dr. Pai, and also for all the panelists? Do you think that this is an example of something that we see in a globalized world, and where do you think this is headed?
It's one of my favorite topics today. Uh, the thing is, Eric Topol was also, I think he was being recruited by McGill, and then he was at Ohio, and now he's in San Diego. He's a cardiologist, and he believes in integrating medicine with internet. As part of what I do in the context of HIV, I think that it certainly is headed in that direction. But the problem is that these technologies are also called disruptive technologies. So you're basically going to disrupt the established medical system, because you're talking about introducing something that is going to induce a change. And as you know, our medical establishments across the world, be it North America, Europe, or Asia, they are resistant to change. But the downside or the flip side is that they are going to introduce a lot of instant access to information, empowerment of patients, convenience, portability. They're also going to introduce or catalyze new business models, because even when we develop these new technologies, we need to take them to scale. So people are trying to figure out how is it that you could, introduce them into different global markets and catalyze health changes there. If you were to ask me whether this is going to grow, for sure it's going to grow. Whether it's going to make a change, we've seen it make a change. So it's just up to people to embrace the change. Whether policymakers are interested in absorbing it, yes, in Canada they are interested in absorbing it. It's just that we need more evidence, and we are working towards generating that evidence. Has it been shown in studies to make a change? There are numerous projects going on worldwide in the context of maternal and child health, in infectious diseases, which is primarily my area, and also in cardiology, where people have shown several different models of introducing online counseling services, online patient adherence, text messaging reminders. There's so many like social media-based empowerment, there's just a huge variety of these programs that are being funded, that are being used, and it's just going to grow. The only problem is that if you have too many of these successful models, you need to stop and pause and figure out how are the systems going to take them up. Some countries are going to be ready to take them to scale, and some countries are not going to be ready to take them to scale. But certainly it's going to grow, it's going to be disruptive, and it's going to be a lot of fun.
I think you gave a great answer. The additional thing, as we know, particularly in Western economies, basically across the world, health is one of the biggest cost items on government's budget, and it's basically unsustainable with the way the demographics are going. And what is also fantastic is, I think the way of disrupting things that it cannot necessarily happen within the system, but it can now happen on the periphery. We can experiment. The people who are willing to take more risks and expose themselves can, with a good feedback loops, actually accelerate the rate of innovation so that then it can be seen to start having some proof points to then be adopted by the more naturally conservative medical institutions. So I think it is huge. It's one of the great things that does need to be solved, just to in terms of the finances and government's economies.
This is not relating to health, but I think it's a great example of we need more evidence of whether something works or not. One of the students in the seminar that gave a talk had asked about the tablet policy. So one of the things that many developing countries do, their governments do, to try to reduce the digital inequality gap. So essentially the gap between those who are able to access the internet and those who can, which is high in most developing world, is to come up with policies that essentially give away free computers or free tablets. And so I'm just going to give you an example of two places which I did in the seminar. One is Uganda, where an NGO, a tech NGO, decided to give free tablets to several rural villages to little children. And at first, it seemed to be well received. Everybody was excited. They had never seen a shiny object like that before, and also moving. And what they found out later on was some of them were stolen. Some were being sold in the black market. Some of these schools didn't have electricity. Many of the kids didn't have shoes. So there's other issues that they didn't envision when it comes to bringing this idea to practice. In Thailand, also the government decided to spend millions of dollars buying up tablets for all first graders in Thailand. It's called the One Tablet, One Child policy. It was working well in the sense of they were able to provide the tablets to the students. What they didn't envision was the fact that teachers didn't know how to use them. So in their government budget, they didn't have a budget to train teachers. They just had a budget to buy tablets. So the biggest failure and lessons that they learned was that these schools and the staff were nowhere near prepared for this policy. And so the policy has turned out to be one of the probably the most expensive failures of this government.
Another question for all the panelists. What role do you think the United Nations will play in a more globalized world?
I don't know. I used to be a great fan of the United Nations. I went to Afghanistan on a panel to advise the Kenyan government a few years ago on whether we should stay in Afghanistan. I saw the action of the UN, both at their headquarters in New York and in the field in Afghanistan. I was very disappointed. There are so many conflicting interests in a wide body like the UN. I don't know. I tend to be more optimistic about some better, smaller, narrower focus international institutions than the UN, but I would like to be proven wrong.
It's a big question and a loaded question, and I think the answer is it depends. I would agree with Mr. Taylor that the UN does a better job in some issues than others. But what I would really think that is emerging in the global governance today, in fact, is potentially the growth in regional cooperation. I really see a potential of this much more than the UN, which is a more multilateral global governance institution, particularly because of the economics. Many of the regions find that in the globalized world, the only way they could really survive or thrive economically is to actually get together with their neighboring countries and cooperate on economic issues on those matters. A good example of this is Southeast Asia, the ASEAN institution, you know, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Many of these countries have fought many wars against one another, don't trust one another at all. There's ongoing disputes practically on every borders of these countries. And yet they decided that out of, you know, the need to survive economically, particularly against, you know, the fact that China is now really important. And, you know, a cluster like the European Union, as a single market together, they were able to benefit from each other more economically. So they decided to strengthen their efforts economically, you know, deepen their economic integration. And through that, although slowly working through some of the political issues they have to face and restoring some of the trust, that they needed to have in order to cooperate with each other. This model hasn't worked well in every region, but I think it provides some hope that in a more globalized world, we could also see more regional cooperation, and it's not just everyone's out for themselves. And I feel that many of the multinational institutions like the UN have failed to meet the needs of many countries. And so smaller scale cooperation might be a way to go in the next decades to come.
I would also say it's disappointing, and it's partly due to the structure. And if you think of the last headline issues where the UN's been involved in, probably over the last year, most of them have ended in stalemate because of the structure and who the participants are. Similar to our discussion about the US Congress this morning, seem in permanent stalemate. The one thing that I do believe, though, it still has a very valid role to bring the spotlight on these issues for the world population to then the sort of moral pressure of it. So I think that is one still valuable role that the UN plays.
My answer is restricted to my field. I think in the field of HIV/AIDS, UNAIDS has done a commendable job, and I think we should congratulate them. They're funding a lot of good mHealth projects, like reaching people around the world, people who live below the poverty line. They don't have a roof over their heads, but they do have a mobile phone. And through the mobile phone, I do believe that we can reach them and we can at least educate them on health messages. Just simple education on health messages sometimes is more powerful than talking about, you know, how the economy is going to survive or how we're going to improve the planet. So I do believe that UNAIDS has done a good job. I agree with all the speakers who've said, you know, UN as an organization has, you know, has had problems. But then in the world of health, WHO has done a lot of commendable job. But the Gates Foundation is now increasingly seen as a huge player in catalyzing global health. And the way they have structured their, you know, their whole programming is basically, it's problem-based programming, problem-based solving. So wherever they see a problem, they try and solve that problem. They try and avoid the bureaucracy of countries, and they try and avoid all the other issues that World Bank faced in trying to improve, you know, major issues like health and poverty and determinants of health. So I do believe that the Gates Foundation is slowly but surely making a huge change in the arena of global health, and certainly in the field of infectious diseases. They've done a good job, and they will continue to do that. So smaller organizations that are more focused and more structured, certainly, as the first speaker said, certainly have a major role to play than these big organizations that they end up serving their own selves at the end of the day. Sometimes it's all about keeping people's jobs and, you know, than really problem solving. And so I do believe that we should not give up on them, but at the same time, they need to wake up to the globalized world and restructure themselves. Then things will happen.
Do any of you have any questions that you'd like to hear the panelists answer? Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, whatever. So, I guess this question goes more for Dr. Pai because you're in the health sector. So in terms of, I guess, because this is a global trend now that's happening in developing countries where you have the birth rate decreasing below replacement, and you find that the more developed a country gets, the lower the birth rate gets. Do you see that in the future it could be a potential issue if, you know, every country in the world has a birth rate that's below replacement?
That's a nice visionary question. I don't think it's going to happen to every country in the world, but it certainly is happening in Scandinavia and Canada too. That's a problem.
And Japan.
And in Japan. So the thing is, in all these countries, you have they are in Japan. Like I visited Japan, and they have worried about their aging population, and they do. You know, the aging demographic presents itself with its own kind of problems. And again, you know, I'm going to bring the same point home. I guess with internet and e-technologies, you know, you can reach these people who are in their homes. Scandinavia has started a project where you can connect to people who are staying by themselves above the age of 75 and they cannot take care of themselves, but if they have crises, they can connect through their internet systems to their local providers. So I think there are solutions that we have to come up with as researchers, as policymakers, as businessmen, to be able to solve their health problems. So so coming back to your question, looping around, I think it's not going to happen to every country because, you know, like a country like India or Thailand, we have like a huge population of younger people than older people. There is no demographic problem. People 75 and above are not very many. So we do have to learn lessons and kind of cross-fertilize those examples.
Okay, perfect, thanks.
All right, I have a more of a cultural question. What do you think the ramifications of globalization on a country's cultural heritage or their heritage? What do you think are those negative? Do you think that the West is impeding their views too much on the rest of the world?
That's a great question. I don't think this is the first time we've had globalization. That's definitely not, definitely for sure. And it's also not the first time that there's a globalization of culture. I think that culture is something that's always evolving and dynamic. As you can see, Canada, you know, the population is also dynamic and changing. I live in BC, where a lot of people, essentially, more than 50% of the people in Vancouver are born outside of Canada, right? And so if you ask them, you know, what's Canadian music? I don't know. They probably couldn't name one. They're probably not maybe Justin Bieber. But so I think that technologies will help spread all of this globalization, but it doesn't mean that it has to be Western-based, right? It could be, J-pop has long been popular. Now K-pop is very popular in Asia. And, you know, each Asian countries learn about each other's TVs and movies. And as Mr. Taylor said, knowing languages is really important. It also spreads, you know, adopting other languages, understanding each other's cultures. So I think this is a good thing. I think that this is the end of an era where there are borders anymore. We're all citizens of the world, and we should learn more about each other and understand each other more so that we can overcome challenges like potential for wars and conflicts and increase cooperation. I don't think that it will affect negatively all the domestic and local cultures.
I would just echo what you said, Aim. I was lucky enough, I grew up in Scotland, first job was in Italy. The chance to be exposed to Italian culture, food, songs, cinema, then France, now here, and it's a joy to discover other people's cultures, and the internet suddenly makes that more accessible to everybody. You don't actually have to go and live in Pescara in Italy to discover that, so I think it's a wonderful thing. I don't think it's something to be feared. I think it's something that enriches all our lives.
I think what both of them have said is really true. So for you as a student, I think there are two things that my father taught me. One is that to be really successful in life, you should give your children strong roots and then give them wings. So you should be well rooted in your identity. You should never have issues about who you are, where you come from. You should never be embarrassed about that. I give that to my daughter. She's of Indian origin, so I keep telling her you're a Canadian of Indian origin. You know, so we have to be true to our identity. at the DNA level, don't ask me what our identity is. You know, if you get down to the level of DNA, you'll be shocked. But your physical identity, you should be proud of your heritage, whatever heritage you come from. Each heritage has its own beauty, its own music. You should learn I'm sorry, I didn't get your name, Alan, and yeah, and they said that, you know, we should learn more languages. That's a wise man's words is worth reading 1,000 books. All the 5 points that he made are just so phenomenal. You guys have to listen to them. Learn languages if you want to be global citizens. All of us are global citizens. All of us get onto the internet. All of us are watching stuff on YouTube. So we are all interconnected today. So be true to your identity and open your mind. The world is huge. The world is vast. There are infinite possibilities of careers and choices. And that's how you're going to grow. And never be afraid to fail. That's one thing that I don't think schools teach you, but never be afraid to fail to try. And that's one thing that I'm going to tell you, because I hated failing too. I hate to be called a failure, but I love failing in research. Because if I don't fail, I'm not going to do something that I'm doing today. So, thank you.
I'd like to know from each of your perspectives in different fields, do you think the world, in terms of globalization, is moving more towards a cultural mosaic or sort of a melting pot of cultures from each of your perspectives, since you're all in different fields? I'd love to hear.
That's a very difficult question. I think the ideal world would be both. As one of my colleagues here have just said, you know, we've got to be comfortable with our identity. At the same time, we should endorse and embrace, you know, other cultures. So for me, whether it is free trade or closer political associations like the Economic Union and so on, I don't think that this should be, or I don't think it is to the detriment of cultural identities. I mean, Poland is one of the countries that has benefited most from joining the Economic Union. You go to Poland today, they are not less Polish than they were before joining. So therefore, yeah, maybe they are open to more languages and so on and so forth. So the ideal world would be that it should not be a contradiction, or it shouldn't be in conflict.
I'll tell you a little bit story of what I experienced in terms of xenophobia or racism. So I was working for the World Bank, and at some point I was living in Eastern Europe. I won't name a country. It was a critical time in that region. They had just, you know, transitioned out of communism, did quite well. Many countries are thinking or actually working on integrating into the European Union. But one issue that they couldn't solve, and this particularly resonates with the older generation that had little exposure to foreigners, was that they were afraid of immigrants, and they were afraid of foreigners. They didn't understand, didn't know. And I found myself watching football, soccer, in one of these countries, and I was under serious danger because of a skinhead movement that was at a soccer club at the time. And when I was warned about this earlier, I was like, that can't be right. I mean, come on, this is, you know, what year are we in, you know? There's no way that, you know, I'm gonna get beat up because I'm, you know, not Caucasian. That's just ridiculous. And when I had experienced it myself and having to flee the place, precisely for that, you know, it shocked me that this is still going on. So in some ways, some countries, despite being in a globalized world, they're gonna fight to the tooth and nail to make sure that the country remains homogeneous. Even though I feel that immigration is inevitable in all levels of life, at some point they're going to accept the fact that with declining population, what have you, they can't afford to do so. But I see hope in young people. This is a generation that travels. You guys travel, you guys go on exchange, live somewhere else, and very likely, you're likely gonna end up in your careers going, living all over the world. And when you come back to their own country and to those countries, you're starting to change the mentality and the minds of the older generation that are not used to being exposed to different cultures. So I was always well received by the younger people. They're really interested in learning about where I'm from and what I do, and this is the hope. So like all of you said, travel, learn something from other people, bring it back, bring new perspectives, and this is really where I think this is going to be really well served in battling against issues like xenophobia.
So I guess this kind of falls under global governance. We saw, like, for example, in Syria, where the United States is still kind of using pressure tactics, like kind of bully method, where they're the biggest army. But with an economy all across the world that's becoming so integrated, where countries rely on each other so heavily, do you see the world transitioning, like, not needing as many, kind of boards of members helping on an international scale, whereas countries can work together because they rely so much on each other?
Actually pick up on, you think about NATO, which for many years started to feel after the end of the Cold War somewhat less relevant. And here we're discussing Crimea and all the neighbors of Ukraine and who are members of NATO wanting confirmation that, as Paul mentioned this morning, in case of invasion, everyone, it's one for all, standing together. So it's very hard to see how institutions that have come about for very strong reasons and built alliances over decades can suddenly disappear. Again, with regard to our conversation about the UN and potential changes there, and the composition of the Security Council, that was formed after the Second World War as well, and nobody wants to give up those powerful positions, and it's part of the issue of, it's not really reflecting the current power and the new world order. So, but seeing it coming from the center and powerful institutions, I don't see them changing in and of themselves. What's really exciting about this revolution and the access to information, the power to exchange, to collaborate, is suddenly at the periphery. You have much more power, something that AIM studies, and I think that's something that we will continue just to see building upon. Power before was to do with the control over information, control over wealth, and the dispersion of that is one of the most exciting trends over the next few decades that you guys are going to be part of.
And you were talking about Syria. When we look at a situation like this, we have to try to understand the underlying forces. I think this is one case where President Obama was outplayed by President Putin. But the underlying forces there is that it's basically a power play between the Shiites and the Sunni. And as one of my colleagues, said in the diplomatic world a few months ago, the Americans or the Russians are not going about to resolve this. This has been going on for 14 centuries. So therefore, if you look at the tension today between Saudi Arabia and the US, it's because Saudi Arabia expected the US to get in because they have an axe to grind in that debate between the Sunni branch, quote unquote, and the Shiite branch of the Muslim world. So I think it's important that when we look at something like this happening and we see, it's awful, what's going on in Syria. It's just got awful, In 21st century, I mean, what is it now, number, hundreds of thousands of people have died and so on and so forth. This country is being, demolished, destroyed completely, and what have you. But the forces at play here, they go back a long time. So, it would be a bit pretentious on the part of the industrial world to say, well, line up, we'll fix this for you. The world is more complex than that. So that's one of the situations where it's very difficult to have good corporate governance, good governance, worldwide.
Hi. This ties back to what we said a couple minutes ago, a couple questions ago about different cultural identities in an increasingly globalized world, and I think it's interesting. So what role do you see kind of more cultural or kind of historic ethnicities, heritages, that type of thing? What role do you see that type of thing playing in a personal identity in a world that's increasingly, you have a lot more to do with people who are very different from you in terms of background? So do you see kind of, like, do you see that as very important to have a personal identity that's rooted in ethnicity?
I just see that as very positive. You have, at the level of the DNA, I think all of us are probably one. It's just that we have to face that reality someday. Because all of us came from Africa, So all of us are, if you deconstruct the DNA, you will probably find fragments of DNA coming from different parts of the world. So in terms of cultural identity, I think your question is, what role do I see? Can you reframe the question for me?
That's exactly it. Like, what do you see that as continuing to be kind of an important source of personal identity in a world where you get to interact with people who are very different from you?
I think it's anything that involves interaction with different people always enriches you, at any level. Like, be it health, be it politics, business, and you have to seek out those opportunities, because in the globalized world you have. Is that the answer you're looking for, or is it some other answer you're looking for? I think it does enrich you. So in our field, we get to collaborate from people across the world. We are collaborating with people from the UK, from Asia, from Africa. And the net product is that, you realize that patterns of health in dysfunctional health systems are the same. And patterns of health in developed systems are also the same. So basically what we have to end up solving are these patterns and problems. And like as Alan mentioned, that these organizations that are at the periphery are actually making a major contribution than organizations at the core, because the organizations at the core are kind of very fixed and just waiting for evidence and waiting for more evidence and waiting for more evidence and heaven knows when. So as a person who's, and all of you all, because you're interested in globalization, that's why you're sitting here, right? So as somebody who's growing up in Canada, in a multicultural country, I think the whole process of like eating a shawarma to, eating your pitas, to having Chinese on a Friday or having Thai food on a Sunday, you have a global palate, I'm sure, or eating sushi for lunch, you have a global palate, you are already in it. It's just that you've got to figure out what you're going to do to help the world. That's going to be your answer. And that you have to do some soul searching. Does that help?
Thank you.
I have a practical advice. So when you guys decide to go on your next trip, wherever it is, the first thing you should do, I think, is to learn how to say hello and thank you in that language for the country that you're going. That's an icebreaker. It's not to show them that you're smart, it's to show them that you care and that you're open and that you want to learn. Learn hello and thank you in that languages. When you get off the plane, try to say those things, and come on, you guys have Google Translation these days on your phone. Need to say something, type it up, or spit it back out, and that's how I communicate with my in-laws, because my French is so bad. I use Google Translate. I use the one that actually speaks back for me. There's one. And two, play dumb. Play dumb so you learn more. You may be an expert on whatever it is, but just cool it down and just ask why. Why do you do this? Oh, where does pita come from? Things like that, so that you really, really learn the most basic things and you build that communication line with the people across culture, and they appreciate it and they ask you back. And these are just basic key things you can do when you travel.
I would maybe add, from my personal experience, as a Scot growing up, I think I was quite nationalist as an 18-year-old at university. And through travel, it's kind of been alluded to here by Nika and everybody, that it gives you an incredibly different perspective, which does not dilute your nationalism or your ethnicity or your pride. But what it does do, I think it gives you a greater appreciation of the strengths, weaknesses of your own culture. You see it in a much more objective way. And the enriching part of meeting other people and appreciating other cultures that adds to you, it only, I think, reinforces. For me, it's not like a zero-sum game. And also, I wish there was, we're talking about, the whole evolution. Your nationality and your ethnicity is like a snapshot in time. If you think of the spectrum of from creation to whatever the ultimate, we are all immigrants of this planet Earth. And it's something that, the more you travel, the more you realize, the more you appreciate. The fact that I happened to be born in Scotland at 1962 and happened to have a British passport, it might be different by the end of this year. It happened that you put everything into the context of time, and it's a different way of, different perception, different value to how you appreciate cultures and your own background and ethnicity.
May I just take half a minute and emphasize what my neighbor here, Dr. Singpan, said. Never lose an opportunity to learn. She said, play dumb. This noon, we had lunch in the boardroom. I was seated next to this lady. We spoke for about 15 minutes. 15. That's not long. I learned. I was talking to Eric for about 10 minutes. I learned. Because of his age, because of what he wants to do in life, and so on and so forth. So, everybody that we meet, whether it is in a subway, in London, in the tube, or wherever, this is a learning opportunity. So going back to the question about identity and culture and so on and so forth, life is a learning process.
So globalization creates a lot of, economically, a lot of emerging economies. You've got the BRICS nations that are becoming powerhouses in the world in terms of their economies. Do you believe, once these nations really reach their full potential, that, the current developed nations like Canada and the United States and Europe are going to have a decline and become a lot less important than they are now? And these emerging economies will become the leaders of the world?
It depends by what you mean by decline. Decline in proportion to or in relation to the role that some countries like China, India, Indonesia, that we don't mention often, that's an awfully big country. Couple of 100 million people, and so on. So in relation to, they will have a stronger voice, they'll play a larger role, but in terms of standard of living, I don't think this is going to be to our detriment. But you're posing a very good question. You know that some economists are wondering whether your generation, you guys and girls in this room, whether your standard of living will end up being higher than ours. In the past, it was never a question. My standard of living is higher than my dad's was. For you, some economists are saying question mark. For us Canadians, that question does not apply to India or to Thailand and so on and so forth. It applies to us here because, we have done pretty well over the last 50 years. So you guys will have to roll up your sleeve to take it to the next level.
just picking up, as we discussed this morning, also you don't have any demographic benefits. It's going to be up to your own ingenuity and creativity to build on that and to create improved productivity. I think it's a healthy thing. I think there absolutely is a relative decline in power of the incumbent West in developed countries. But that, if we want reduced poverty, if we want the global economy to grow, it's going to have to come where the population growth is and where the majority of the populations are. So I think it's a healthy thing. It's going to be difficult. There's going to be lots of adjustments. But I think when you think on a planetary basis, it has to be a good thing. Otherwise, how are we going to have better wealth distribution? How are we going to include Africa to really be a participant in the world economy, and so on?
Hi. Recently I watched a documentary about gendercide in India and China, and about how girls are murdered after they're born and they're not valued as they are in China and India. And there's no doubt that the Western world has an influence on the Eastern world. And in the Western world, we're gaining gender equality. But in terms of the Eastern world, there is such an influence, and I've been to Asia before, it's changing there too. But when will this gender side stop? When will it begin to slow? Is there any future for it to slow?
That's a very hard question to answer. When is it going to stop? Well, most of the genocide that the country that I come from, and gender bias has been one of my favorite topics because I lived it. I was training to be a surgeon in India. And surgery, as you know, is a very patriarchal, even in the West, is a very patriarchal profession. And so I was told that I should probably not consider becoming a surgeon because I will not have a great practice. And because I was told that I wouldn't do it, I just persisted with it, and I got more patients because, there were fewer women surgeons, right? The thing is that the patriarchy is so dominant, is so much in the South Asian, I can't speak for Thailand, but I guess it probably is true, in the DNA of men. It is so dominant that it's an accepted norm of society. So it's very different from the West, so probably you will never be able to understand what it is. I don't see any benefits to it, but the thing that the culture is so, it's perpetrated through centuries. It's perpetuated through mythology. Everything is so dominant in that patriarchal mode. So being born a girl is not valued. So that is the reason why genocide happens, right? And so there's been so many studies looking at, the declining female to, the declining male to female ratio in different parts of India, and they've raised that, and the government has taken actions to stop sex-selective abortions. So people are not doing that, but it's still happening on the sly. But the point is that, what moms need to do, and there's the other issue of rape. So many women in India today get raped, left, right, and center. I mean, it's that bad. I'm scared of traveling by myself. I travel to every part of the world, but because I was chauffeured and I lived a very privileged life in India, when I land at the airport, I actually call people to pick me up from the airport. So that's because it's cultural conditioning. You're just so scared of venturing out in the dark by yourself. So whether it's going to change? No, it's going to take centuries to change. I can give you a very visionary statement. Yes, it's going to change. No. It needs moms to tell their sons that men and women are born equal. How many moms are going to do that? You've got to first educate the moms to get them to the level where they're going to believe that men and women are equal. Are born equal, they have the right to equal health, they have right to equal life, they have right to education. And you need to educate the boys out there, the boys who are going to become men, and the men out there who are really so engendered in this paradigm that men are superior, which I totally feel that it's such a strong paradigm. So it's a very complex problem, and it's going to take years to solve. Hopefully, with the newer generation, it will probably be better. But I do see gender bias here too. I mean, I would be wrong to believe that it doesn't exist. It does exist. There is a virtual glass ceiling in business. There are gender disparities in salaries of female and male scientists. There is this lady who's the CEO of COO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg. I encourage all the girls to read her book, Lean In. I read her book and I actually leaned in, even in my own department. And I said, I'm not saying that, but I read Sheryl Sandberg and it's inspired me to lean in, and I'm asked for a salary raise. And I did ask for a salary raise, and they were surprised because women don't ask. Women love to sit at the back. Even if women are very intelligent, they don't want to ask. They just feel that things are going to magically come to you. They won't. You've got to fight for it. You've got to be there. See, all the guys are sitting here in front. All the girls should come and sit in the front row, in front of them. You've got to go and fight. You've got to go and fight for your rights. You've got to go and put yourself out there. It's not going to happen otherwise. It's never going to happen. Trust me, it's not going to happen. So that's where you are. So you become a leader, inspire all of them.
Thank you.
So earlier on, we talked a lot about like globalized trade between different countries. So for instance, take Saudi Arabia's oil trade with the United States. Would you argue that this type of relationship is kind of artificial and that's actually a downfall to globalization and trade between different countries?
Trade between Saudi Arabia and...
Well, that was just an example of just how countries basically use each other for natural resources, and wouldn't you, and basically my question was asking, wouldn't you say that this kind of trade breeds artificial relationships?
So two countries making more money is not, it's an artificial relationship.
Like, I wouldn't say that necessarily the United States and Saudi Arabia have the best relationship with each other than just trading oil. I don't know.
Well, I think another way you can look at it is the way, if you view the world as there are friends and foes, and that certain nations are friends with each other forever, and certain nations are foes with each other forever, I don't think that's true. I think it depends on what issue. Right? Many of the countries that have, economic embargoes, they actually coordinate on issues like health. It really depends on the issue. So I don't think that those relationships of, you're in the West, you're with us or not, I don't think that's true on every case. I think what you're trying to get at is that some trade relationships have clear winners and losers. That certain countries are clearly exploited by having a trade relationship with another because, that's the only way they can grow their economy. I think that's your case. So one example might be, mining, right? I think you were mentioning this about Mongolia. I think if you are in a country that feels that you're clearly going to be in a disadvantaged position, meaning you're likely the one with the raw minerals, it's the government's job to make sure that they're actually fighting for something that they would actually give back to the people. There's two levels of problems with this. One, making sure that the governments of the receiving country won't actually pocket the money, which is a lot of the cases in developing countries. They make a deal with the multinational companies. They said that they would, they need certain money to develop certain things for their people, but it ends up in their own pockets. So there's corruption going on. So that, the leaders have to be benevolent about it to their own people. They have the responsibility to make sure that it gets trickled down to the people. And secondly, and I think this is more of the case dealing with certain corporations, is that they need to be clear and upfront and consistent about what they want from the relationship. They can't just keep changing their mind halfway through. So for example, if you make a deal that you're going to give a land permit for a number of years to this company, make sure that you actually comply and obey by the promise that you gave. And don't, turn back on it 5 years in because the government changed or what have you. These kind of, uncertainties with businesses, it really drives them away and drive political risk high. And so mutual benefits, I don't think that in every case can be 100%, 100%, but even if it's 70 and 30, it's still better than 100 and 0. You just gotta have to look at it that way. Yeah.
Well, on the last point that you just made, as you may know, there is an organization called Transparency International, and they report on the quality of the transparency of big players, big international players. And for instance, at Rio Tinto, and if you go on the internet, we have been publishing for the last 3 years a detailed breakdown of the taxes we paid. In 2013, Rio Tinto paid $9.3 billion of taxes around the world. And if you check under Canada, you're going to see how much we paid to the Canadian government, how much we paid to the province of Quebec, province of Newfoundland, province of British Columbia, where we have activities. And within Quebec, you're going to see how much we pay to the municipality of Arvida, Alma, and so on and so forth. So therefore, in Canada, you know, we have public accounts, and we have opposition parties and so on. But in countries where these do not exist, that report is out there. So the NGOs and the others can see whether, you know, the government rulers are putting these monies, you know, into their pocket, or whether it goes into the state coffers.
Sadly, we only have time for about 1 or 2 more questions. So if we could have non-LCC students go for the last 2, that'd be great. Thank you.
In regards to the topic of sex trafficking of young women internationally, as globalization has grown and increased, this issue has grown and increased as well. And do you think, as obviously globalization will continue to expand, anything will be done about this issue as it's becoming easier and more tangible for this to continue?
Sex trafficking. Great. I come from a country with a lot of that issue. I think there's much greater awareness about that, but it's still an ongoing. I mean, prostitution is like the biggest, the oldest profession out there, and also, you know, what comes with that is sex trafficking and whatnot. I think a country like Canada, for example, can really help in this fight against sex trafficking in a number of ways. And one tangible way it can do it is that Canada used to have a visa, a special visa for people in the entertainment industry, but very, very broadly defined. It's not well regulated. And so many of the women that had been trafficked from various parts of the world had come through Canada legally through this visa. There's entertainment includes a number of professions, right? You could be an actor, you could be, you know, a singer and whatnot. So many of them were under the guise of their working as masseuses or in entertainment in districts, in bars. So I think there has, you know, a few NGO had exposed the loophole in the Canadian system to show that this has been the way that many of the women had been trafficked illegally into the country, and then they ended up in, you know, brothels all over the Canadian cities. So after having exposed that, they had to revisit this regulation and really actually do the monitoring part. And evaluating whether the people that received this visa were actually legitimate and had legitimate professions. So I think for, you know, you may think that, you know, a lot of the sex trafficking are in developing countries. That's not true. Many of the women trafficked into developed countries may come from developing countries, but that doesn't shed our responsibility from this issue. So I think keeping the issue, you know, high on priority, raise the awareness about it, and understanding that it's a multifaceted issue, that in fact, an illegal issue like sex trafficking can be done legally in what ways, and finding the loopholes and exposing them are really important.
Hello. My question is for Ms. Pai. It's a follow-up by Mr. Eric's very first question of the day. It has to do with the new technology for a scanner on the iPhones. And Ms. Pai's response was that some countries can use this new technology and some can't. So my question is, what steps can we take as a society to implement this new technology on a global scale?
to be able to get a new technology, you've got to first, so there are two ways around it. A, I think there are federal regulatory bodies that have to get their act together to accommodate. There's no category right now to accommodate these newer innovations that are coming out on the market. So they have to get their act together to kind of create clauses and put them in a particular class of device, right? So once that is done, every, like Health Canada has certain classes, but they have to create new classes. FDA is working to create newer sections and amend their different sections to accommodate newer technologies that are coming out. Why is that important? Because to be able to sell any device, any new device, you need to have approval of the government and of FDA and Health Canada and CE and every country. So that's important. To be able to get there, you need to generate evidence. So that's what we do. So you have to do clinical trials and clinical studies, well-designed trials to be able to prove that these technologies work. Once that is done, then they can be sold by manufacturers in the open market. So those steps are important. Once those steps are done, then WHO has its own pre-qualification criteria, and they lay out their criteria, and that can be, that is used to sell these devices onto in other countries. So that's the process. So to be able to scale them up legally, this is the legal process, but people do put stuff out on the internet and you can buy it, but that's the illegal. That is one thing that I don't think it's a good way of going around it. It's better to do it the legal way because then, there are repercussions. Recently, I must inform you guys, there was a device, a company called 23andMe where you could send your oral sample and you could get your a profile of all the genetic diseases that you're likely to have, that you have a probability of having. So it was a big list that you got from the company. And a lot of people were making decisions based on that. A lot of people in the United States, it was very, very, very hot and happening. And recently FDA cracked down on it, and they said that they hadn't really gone through the legal process of really doing all the studies and really complying to FDA guidelines. So then it had to be withdrawn. So there are consequences to doing stuff, like if you go to the direct consumer and try and market them. Does that answer your question? It's a big one.
Yeah,
it does. Okay.
Thank you very much.
We had lots of great questions in the sessions that Paul and I did today. We're really impressed by your engagement, your interest, your level of knowledge. I also sensed a lot of concern and about the threats and challenges, and I think they are huge, but I also think there have never been more opportunities. I would like to echo what Paul and the rest of the panel, I think, believe. Your generation is uniquely placed to take advantage of these opportunities and to make a massive contribution to making the world a better place. So it's been a great privilege to be with you today, so thank you.
I think that it is important, for our successors, you, the organizing committee, in terms of selecting the next panel for the next DQ event, I think it's very important for you to collect the feedback. What is it that you enjoyed? What is it that you did not enjoy? Was the level of presentation was too technical, not enough, broad enough, and what have you? And all this should be given back, to Patrick Prieto. I think that it would make the next session even better, So thank you very much for inviting me, and I have enjoyed the last 6 hours, 7 hours. Thank you.
I would like to thank also for having me. I always don't pass the opportunity of hanging out with your generation. You may think that I may come from the same generation as you, but it's not true. I grew up half of my life without the internet, so you can do the math. Um, Also, I want to mention that I'm gonna, I have some time. So after this is over, if you wanna talk, you can tell me about what you're interested in. I'll be here. So I would love to learn more about what you want to do, and I would like to echo what everybody said about this is the most exciting time for all of you, to get out there and to learn about one another. And I would start locally, your neighbor next door. Start small. Take care of your own community, take care of your own family. They're going to be the bedrock of your life. Wherever, the travel may take you, the study may take you later on in life, your family is very important. Take good care of them, have a sit-down dinner with your folks and actually tell them really what you're thinking about things. Be honest and open. I spent half of my life not having that because I've been abroad, and those first half of my life that I did spend every day with my family was really important. It's good grounding for you, and also they're always there for you, wherever you're gonna end up being, and likely you're all gonna probably be leaving Quebec and traveling in far corners of the world. So take care of your own family, pay attention to your own community. If you see something that's not right, say something, and try to make a difference just around you in your community. So this is a great and exciting time, and I look forward to hearing more about what you're interested in, and I'm available. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been fun. I've given a lot of I've been in a lot of student conferences for the past few days, so this has been the most exciting of all, I must say. So thank you. There are just two things that I would like you to do. Be a sponge. Just be a sponge. Absorb the world, open your palette, have a global palette. Just be a sponge. Read books. I think your generation loves to go on the internet. Google and Wikipedia are great, but if you really want to be a good thinker, read. Read lots of books. There are fantastic books out there. If you need recommendations on health, you can email me. Read a lot of books because they will give you clarity of thought. They will give you depth, which I think your generation needs to have. And decide to focus on one area. Decide, even if you want to get on and take on the world, decide to focus on one area of specialization and then add on other things. And lastly, I would like to conclude in the words of Mahatma Gandhi: be the change you want to be in the world. Be the change. Thank you.
On behalf of everyone on the executive committee, we'd like to give this token of our appreciation to all the speakers for taking the time out of their busy schedules to come and speak. We really appreciate you coming, and on behalf of everyone in this room, it was extremely interesting to hear you. Another round of applause for our panelists.